Tomorrow belongs to those who prepare for it today. A seed planted today takes root and grows into a tree that bears fruit in the future. Over 110 years ago, a seed was planted. Today, that seed, the idea of excellence, has grown into the University of Pretoria, South Africa's largest contact research-intensive university. 9 faculties and a business school are spread across 7 beautiful campuses, which are home to over 50,000 students, ready to make an impact in the world beyond university and join our global network of nearly 300,000 alumni. Future-focused, sustainably developed facilities and cutting-edge multi- and transdisciplinary research are underpinned by a desire to transform lives and have a positive impact on communities and the world. Excellence in teaching, learning, research innovation, arts and culture, and sports puts us firmly amongst the world's best universities. Knowledge is not just what is in books. It is the wisdom to apply it, to nourish and nurture the seed so that it takes root, grows tall, bears fruit, and branches out. UP plants that seed, that tiny bit of curiosity, creativity, critical thinking, hope, the desire to care, respect, help, and innovate against all odds, to grow, to leave your mark, to excel, to challenge the norm, to think, to rethink, to discover, to inquire, to lead, to have courage, to make a difference, and to persevere. This is the University of Pretoria. We make today and every day matter.
Our host for the evening is Professor Tawana Kupe. Professor Kupe has been the Vice-Chancellor and Principal of the University of Pretoria since 2019. In December 2019, he received an honorary doctorate from Michigan State University in the US and another from the University of Montpellier in France in October 2021. Please welcome our host for the evening. Thank you, Professor Kupe.
Thank you, Professor Jan Elof, Acting Dean of the Faculty of Engineering and the Built Environment. I like your introduction. It was short. You could have deleted the stuff about the honorary doctorates because that betrays my age. But a very warm evening to everyone who's here. You will all agree with me this is an exciting day for multiple reasons. But I'll just stick to 2. We're very proud of Professor Vukosi Marivate. My friend, who's not here yet, Professor Chilizi Marwala, taught Professor Marivate for his master's. And he's always saying to me, please, can I have Vukosi? And I'm always saying, yes, if he agrees. If he doesn't, I'm sorry. I hope he doesn't want to take him to Japan. The university should stay here, Professor Marivate. But first, let me say something about the UP Expert Lectures. It's a series that provides a public platform for UP researchers to engage with the general audience on significant developments in their fields of expertise that are likely to have an impact in the future. We appreciate your attendance at this lecture to be enriched and informed by the university's research output, because the man I'm about to introduce is really a truly it's never wise, actually, and is discouraged for reasons of discrimination to refer to people's age. But I think it is also empirically true that he is a young man, and I'm an older man. But for a young man of his age to be so brilliant is truly amazing, and of the African soil, but a global scholar and champion. And who is he? Professor Vukosi Marivate is the ABSA UP Chair of Data Science. In case some people don't really understand, here at the University of Pretoria, must be very clear about that. We only have the top young people here. Marivate works on developing machine learning and or artificial intelligence methods to extract insights from data. A large part of his work over the past few years has been in the intersection of machine learning and natural language processing. His work in this area focuses on techniques to improve tools for and availability of data for local languages on low-resource languages. Marivate is a co-founder of the Deep Learning Indaba. He currently serves as a co-founder and chief investigator on the Masakane NLA project and on the steering committee of the Lacuna Fund. His recent milestones are recipient of the Google Research Scholar Program Award in 2022, recipient of the NVIDIA GPU grant for 2022. He was promoted to associate professor as of 1 January 2022. Is what we call a newly minted professor. You can still feel it today, 6 months later. Received an NRF C3 rating and is going to get an NRF A1 rating in no time. I say so because I'm the Vice Chancellor. He was nominated for an NSTF Emerging Researcher Award. He's a Future Professors Program Fellow from 2020 to present. And notice, within 2 years of being that fellow for future professors, he was promoted to a professor. So that's why I can say he's going to be A1 in no time. A Harvard South Africa Fellow in 2020 and 2021, and he received a Mail and Guardian 200 Young South Africans COVID-19 Heroes Award. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you young professor, the future, the present, and the top scholar, young Professor Vukosi Marivate. Professor Marivate, this is your honor.
Thank you, Prof. Kupe, and also Prof. Ilov for that. Today, my presentation is going to be really looking back at the last, I think now 6 to 7 years of work in natural language processing and machine learning, and how the work of myself, collaborators, research group has really moved around, trying to understand how we can work with local languages in South Africa. I dedicate also this presentation in memory of Siyabonga Africa, who's also an alumnus of University of Pretoria, and Defo Mohapi, who were both brilliant technologists, and not just in their fields, whether being in journalism, in technology, or journalism in terms of the innovations in journalism, but we work together in different ways and really trying to understand the ways we can improve the state of affairs in the country. To kick it off, I wanted to really talk about the theme of telling our stories on that part. So thank you to the Vice Chancellor for introducing me, but I also wanted to highlight, one, I'm from Harankua, which is in the northwest of this city of Tshwane. I was born and grew up there. Went to Wits for a bit. The first time I met Prof. Kupe was at Wits University for my electrical engineering degree and also master's. I took also some time at then Rutgers University. In between the other spaces that have been highlighted, I also took some time as an intern at Mibo, at Google in San Francisco, as well as Newton, working in different internship roles around machine learning and data science, especially in this part of really making an impact in other people's lives. At the University of Pretoria, I lead the Data Science for Social Impact Research Group. This research group works in these spaces of natural language processing and machine learning and data science for society. Sometimes people ask and say, why is that difference? There's one thing to do science in a way where you come up with new methods, and then those methods, we publish them, and then that's it. And then there's another thing of trying to figure out, how really do I get these methods into the hands of other people who impact the lives of the rest of the country. And to do this, you need to deal with many other things, whether it's politics, understanding health system, understanding education systems, working with people in these spaces in such a way that you can translate that research into something that's also practical. And as such, we also have students and members who really look into that as part of their masters or PhDs within these spaces. The research group itself is a very dynamic and welcoming space, that allows for different sets of people, not just young really, to look at different problems and then from there come up with innovative approaches in their space. So these are just some of the members that I've highlighted here that cover all the way from honors degree students to PhDs, and very soon we'll be having our first few sets of postdocs as well. There are other students also that are not pictured, and there's also a set of many alumni over the years that have come in and out of the lab. So in telling us our stories, I'll start with a story on my side. So in 2009, I started my PhD at Rutgers University in New Jersey in the US. And you've moved away from home, now you're living in a foreign country, you start getting some homesickness. So one of the things that happened, I think I was watching some show late at night, and they said how many hours do people spend watching TV versus how many hours actually spent editing Wikipedia. And then that really got to me. Then I went on Wikipedia and said, okay, what are the things that I could edit? And then I thought, oh, it should be something that is actually connected with my life. So I went on Wikipedia and I brought up Harangua, which is where I was born. And then this was what the Wikipedia of Harangua looked like in 2009. So very quickly, you will spot some things that are problematic. One, Harangua is not in the Northwest. It was in the Northwest a long time ago. In 2009, it was not in the Northwest even. So that's an issue. And also, Harangua has a very rich history and is really the part of the tapestry of this country as well. And that cannot be reduced to one paragraph at all on that part. So why is this? That now if you think about a child doing an assignment, will only find that one paragraph on that part. So I took it then upon myself, not just to take Harangua, but a lot of the townships around the city of Tshwane, and start putting in the scaffolding that would allow people to come in and start doing editing. So this is what in around May 2010, what now the Harangua page looked at on Wikipedia. On that part. So a little bit more structure, some information on there, and then hopefully you build it, people will come kind of situation. That's what I was hoping for. So then let's move to 2010 in earnest. I come back home, want to get married, and then also to enjoy the World Cup during that time. I'm back here. Living with then my wife in downtown Pretoria. Decide to then go visit the SKM Pahlele Library, which is the premier library from the municipality of the city of Tshwane, to go ask if they have information on the townships in the Pretoria area that I can use as reference material that I can then edit these Wikipedia entries. Lo and behold, I talk to the librarian goes away for a long period of time and comes back, and she had just printed all the Wikipedia articles I'd been editing for the last 8 months. Right, and that's the thing here, so the whole point that such a simple thing, but hinges on it now becomes the de facto information that's available, right? And if we don't tell our stories, it's almost like they don't exist on that part. This is the Wikipedia page today in 2022. Right, you can see it's very large on there, and lots of other information. Scholars have come in, taken their thesis and added sections on that part. You can check Attridgeville, you can check Mamelodi. People have been working now to edit on there, and for me, it was that small thing that started because of one evening watching a show and talking about editing Wikipedia. I started doing that, but it really taught me this thing of we really should tell our stories over time. The next one then was thinking about the price and debt of inaction on this part. And this is where I started in earnest in talking about language. So we talk about artificial intelligence and machine learning. And in thinking about this, text and language is a very rich interface to share information and also interact with machines. There are things that we have to ask ourselves, really. How do machines process language information? And also, why is local language important? What's natural language processing? It's a very broad field encompassing many tasks, including things like extracting parts of speech in a piece of text. Think finding nouns, verbs, adjectives, name identity recognition, identify person names, organizations, etc. Question answering, speech recognition, text-to-speech, speech-to-text, topic modeling, sentiment classification, translation, which is probably a lot now is used on that part. I'll take a detour though, because there's a lot of assumptions that you end up making here about people's understanding of just saying artificial intelligence and machine learning. One, these are used in a lot of NLP breakthroughs. For a lot of people, one of the first ways you might have interacted with something that looks like AI and machine learning and also is dealing with natural language processing would have been with a search engine, right? You put in a query. And now you have virtual assistants where you talk to your phone and then they respond. Then we have things like chatbots. When you're online and you then start chatting to, to somebody, do you know if that person is a human or not on the other side? You have things like translation systems that are available, and likely also the first piece of technology that you would have touched on that was machine learning plus natural language processing was a spam filter in your email, on that part. So one, artificial intelligence from a classical definition is you have an agent, it could be a machine, it exists in some environment, it can take action, and it takes these actions to achieve some goal on that part. So what does this mean? For example, here, one of our daughters is watching one of the robot vacuum that we have at home. It's a machine, it's this robot that can move around the house. It can sense things like on the floor, so make sure it doesn't fall off an edge. What it can, the actions that it can take is it can move, it can vacuum, it can try to avoid obstacles, and the goal is to try and clean the floor on that. And then from this classical definition, that's an artificial intelligence. Right? In the same way that a search engine can be thought in the same way, it's a machine that exists on the internet. You put in a query, it goes and then checks databases, tries to make sense of your query. It then responds with some list of websites, and the goal is to return things that are actually relevant to what your query was. That's an artificial intelligence. Now, what's machine learning? Machine learning is a subset of AI that deals with learning patterns from data. So let's go from there. So let's say we have these two data points, one being red, the other one being blue. If in the future now a new data point were to show up but it doesn't have a color, how do you then predict what it's supposed to be? The simplest way is to learn some kind of decision function. And given these two pieces of data that I have, you could then learn something that simple as just a straight line that cuts our data into two, and then say anything that comes on the left in the future, I'm going to just classify as being red or predict that it's red. Anything that's on the right, I'm going to say it's blue. Sure, this is very simplistic. You can increase the complexity of your data. So let's say now this is the new data set that we have. And if we do that, you'll see that now the decision boundary is complex on that part. And then still you could say, but that's a very simplistic thing. But this is really where you can build up to a lot of the machine learning that we have today and the tools whereby you can take a picture and you have models that can identify what's in the picture. Like here, using a deep neural network that can then take in a picture and then tell you that actually in this picture there's a dog instead of a cat. Right? So that's machine learning. We've learned now what AI is as well. On that part. Why do we talk about machine learning? In the past, you would have to, when you're programming a machine to do something, you would have to give it a very, a specific set of instructions. But with machine learning, you can collect the data of examples. In this case, what I've shown you is supervised machine learning, where you can show it, here's what the input is, and here's what the output is supposed to look like, and then it learns the connections between those two over time, over that data on that part. This is then where we come with low resource natural language processing. We need this data. So in thinking about low resource natural language processing, yes, we have many speakers, but we don't have many resources. We might not have the data like speech, text, and other multimedia information, or tools, things like digital dictionaries or grammar tools on that one. The challenge of low resource languages is that there's a low availability of resources, hard to discover these resources, hard to reproduce some of the models that need to be built up. People might not want to focus on this work of saying, if I write papers in here or I come up with something in this space, other people won't notice because it's of a language that they think might be obscure, right? Benchmarks or lack of scale and complexity, of this problem on there. And then this is discussed in the paper by Martinez and Abbott. But the African continent has a very rich linguistic base. Another view of it is that you can classify like languages given these resources between the winners and then the left behinds. Where the winners, you have things like English, Spanish, German, Japanese, and French, which have few speak the percentage of languages that are in there have speakers but have most of the resources. If you go to isiZulu, it's now in the hopefuls that it could move if resources are built into the rising stars on that part. But there's still that challenge. Just focusing on South Africa and going back a bit to Wikipedia. One, if you look at the circulation, this is 2019 numbers of newspapers and what languages they are actually published in. You see the Sunday Times, Soka Laduma in English. Only other languages there, Afrikaans, a bit of isiZulu on that. That's on the left. If you go on the right, this the amount of articles on Wikipedia that are written in that language. So number one is English. It has 6 million articles on Wikipedia that are written within that language. In South Africa, if you go to number 2, it will be Afrikaans with about 89,000 articles that are written in Afrikaans on Wikipedia. Quickly, you fall off exponentially, where you have Sepedi at 8,000, isiZulu at 1,000, even though it has 22% of speakers in the country on that one. And there, one of the things that is a standout, isiNdebele has 0 articles written in Indebele on Wikipedia. Even today, I checked so that I don't say the wrong thing. So, how did we get here in some spaces? So, many countries in the global south are affected, one, by history of colonialism, and these affect also our languages. Ultimately, the resources today are affected by this history. Another point, also, a lot of available resources are affected by actually Christian missionaries. Ultimately, the resources we have today then are produced by these missionaries. There's a big focus on English. Even the translation tools and recording of our languages for the first time was behind this religious backdrop on the right. And then we have to ask ourselves, how do we change it on there? In many African countries as well, historical local languages are looked down upon, right, as a consequence of this colonialism, right? And in some places, we know even here in South Africa, people being forbidden of speaking languages, even in schools on this side. This affects the resources. There's a direct connection within that space. Ngugi wa Thiong'o talks about also that language is not just symbols. It's not just these words we put together so that we can communicate. It carries culture, right? And with that culture, it also, it carries the values that we live by within our communities, right? And how we perceive ourselves in the state of the world. And that's why it's important to do this work. I might be a researcher in AI and machine learning, but then I've had to learn, saying like, there's more that we can do in. But the longer we wait here in terms of building up these resources, the more expensive it becomes to tackle the social debt or challenge. If you go back to South African history to the 90s, where now we're coming into freedom, and there were all these promises that, hey, we're going to go in and tackle and make sure that languages are put up as being first rate, develop these languages, develop the resources, so we get to a point where even in higher education, we're really interacting in that way, but we keep on pushing that back. Okay, we can't solve it now. We'll solve it 5 years from now. We'll solve it another 5 years from now. And what that becomes is that it just acts like a high interest credit card or debt, where it becomes so expensive every time you try to think, I should really pay this down. So what do? The easiest thing to do is like, why don't we just deal in English? Right, that's the consequence of that. So now I can look at what are we doing then to try and tackle some of this challenge. So I'll do this through talking about 3 projects that we worked on within our research group. One being, okay, let's tackle some of these data issues. As you'll see, we have a really diverse set of students who are working on from different institutions across the country as part of the DSIDE program that was at the CSR, sponsored by the DSI on that part. In this one, the idea was, can we use the national broadcaster as a resource? So what we did there is that SABC has 19 radio stations, 5 TV channels, has an online digital news website which is in English, It currently, doesn't publish in any other language on their website, but it has these radio stations in all 11 languages, and they run these social media pages for those radio stations, as well as they'll have SABC Dikgang for Setswana, and they have social media websites for that. We downloaded the data from all of these little snippets, and then working with the students, we then categorized each of the little snippets that came from the social media sites for the SABCs. So we annotated it, and then from there, it's very small. You'll see just 219 for Setswana and 491 little snippets of news for Sepedi on that part. These were just some of the common words within that space. What can we do with this? Well, we can take other data, the one that doesn't have to do with news, so things like Wikipedia, the Bible, the Constitution. The South African Center for Digital Language Resources also has data that we've collected over a while. We train these things that allow us to represent that text and then pass it through the machine learning to give it the example of here's the input text and here's what the category is supposed to be. By doing that, we were able to get almost like 60% accuracy. So you could give us snippets of text in Sepedi or Setswana that had to do with news, and we could tell you this is like culture, this has to do with public safety, this has to do with sports, this has to do with business. So this was like, here's a proof of concept, we can try this, and we can get to somewhere where we're at 60%. We're not yet there at the very high 90s, but at least it's a beginning, and there's other way of actually collecting this data. What then happened? We created now these things called vectorizers that get us to represent this text for a machine, and we publish them openly, and they're openly available. We also then released the data now with the categorization, and it's available on this platform called Zenodo, so other researchers can go and get it. Where does this put us now as the research group? So in terms of our relative progress, maybe now we have these ideas 20% done, with what we want to do in terms of data. The methods of tools of these machine learning algorithms that we have, we're at 10%. Second project to highlight. Now we say, okay, fine, we can do this on the data side. Here's some ideas. How do we deal with the methods on that part, so that the methods can still deal, even if you don't have a lot of data, you come up with models that are still robust. So here, working with Chapiso Sefara, we wanted then to look at this concept of augmentation. So if you think about images, like if you want to feed an image into a machine learning algorithm, one of the things that you can do is that you can artificially increase your data by doing a few things. You can flip the image, you can rotate it, you can change some of the colors, even though the label is the same. You can say there's a plane on the picture, but then you're changing it in different ways. So you can go from just one example and having 20 examples just because you've done these little augmentations on the data. So we then said, hey, let's actually go into investigating the effects of this in natural language processing, especially on these shorter texts, right? Remember, we were taking snippets of news, not the full articles. So now let's look at the shorter pieces of text. So to do that, we can then use this kind of method as regularization. What does regularization mean? It just makes it more robust towards error on that part. So there were 4 methods we investigated, especially in the short text word. One was identifying synonyms. So you get a piece of text, you choose a word, and then you find a synonym for it, and then you replace it. And now you've got 2 examples instead of 1. Right, so that's called synonym replacement. Now what that requires is that you must have like some sort of thesaurus on that part. But you might not have that, and there's methods to automatically learn if there's languages that are similar to each other. This is called word2vec. And then the other way is that you can use these translation systems to do something called round-trip translation. So you can go from, I've got a Setswana text, let me translate it into English, and then translate it back from English into Setswana, and that creates another example on that part. So that's called, and then there's something else that's a regularizer, which is called mix-up, which instead of acting on the words, it acts on the representations of the words. So these are just some examples. So like with the WordNet, which is a a lexical database. Especially for English, it also has these things called synsets, which is they're like synonym sets on that part. So with that one, with the WordNet one, which is there in the middle, you can have a sentence like, in the afternoon, John is going to town. You can set it up so you can choose whether it replaces nouns or replaces verbs, and then it creates a new sentence. Joseph is walking to town in the afternoon. With the Word2Vec one, it can identify words that seem to be similar and do the same thing. And then with the round-trip translation, there's many services out there that you can use and try to do that. So the data that we got were from 3 different data sets. One was a sentiment analysis on Twitter data in English, hate speech data set, and for longer text, we use this one called AG News, which has news articles with a number of labels on the part. And then those are the different sets of the sizes of data, so as you can see. So one of the things that was interesting is that if you did no augmentation, we reduced the data size. So even though in the previous one, you can see that the data is a lot. If we reduce it to just 10,000 examples, and you don't do any augmentation, so what you want is to reduce the error. So on this graph, if you are high, that's higher error, you're doing badly. If you're low, less error, and you're doing better. We use one of the machine learning algorithms on there, a simpler one, and you can see if you don't do any augmentation, your error still stays higher. If you do some augmentation like synonym replacement, Word2Vec, you start going lower. And if you put it together with this mix-up method, which is a regularization method, you can really do well. For the simple one with AG News, where it's formal news text, you can see by doing round-trip translation plus the mix-up, you do better. If you use a more complicated method, like a deep neural network, in the same way, the regularization is important. The augmentation is important, even if you don't have a lot of data. So for us, they started giving us that, we can actually we can target low resource languages by using augmentation. But then we have some of these problems that, for one, round-trip translation is actually expensive. So it's very easy to use a translation system like Google Translate for yourself, where you're doing 1 or 2 sentences, but just imagine now you have to do millions. You actually have to start paying. For this project, I think we got $3,000 of like a grant from Amazon Web Services, and we were able to actually do this. Just that graph that you saw cost $3,000. Right. So thinking about this in another way, it's very expensive on that part. So then it has to be the synonym things. But if you have to have synonyms, you have to have these digital dictionaries that have these thesauri, and they're not there as well on that part. So what it meant was we could then look at these ways of doing either round-trip translation by building our own translation models, or doing Word2Vec based models that we need to build for other people. So on the good side, there was other work that we did to actually improve the word nets for South African languages, and we've published them on there, but they're still lacking these synsets for synonyms on that one. Even on AG News, where it was proper news, or on the Sentiment 140, where it was using social media, they were competitive when we reduced the data on that part, to just simulate a low resource language. But it's not perfect, right? You can't just reduce the size of English and then say, that's a low resource. It's not. There's a lot of things. It's got word nets that have synsets, all those types of things. It's easy to get translation systems for it on that. So there's still more to solve, right? So we're building it up on there. What did we do? On this, as the research group is very much big on opening. Earlier I showed you releasing data sets. With this one, we also released a library. This library allows then other researchers and developers to be able to download it and use it to try and use these methods. At the moment, I think it's about 5,000 people download it every month and use it. And we also collaborate with other researchers in this space as well to continue improving these tools in augmentation. So now, let's say data is 20%, methods and tools were up to 40% on that part. Then there's this part of community of practice that still might be missing on that one. Then we get to the third project. And this one now, we bring in and say we have to work with linguists. We need to understand the languages further than we're just taking in tokens and then we're trying to then do machine learning on it. So this is the project called Tokofata. Here, a collaboration between Soplaki, University of Hawaii, University of Pretoria at the moment as it stands. So here, we want to curate data sets more carefully for Setswana. evaluate the quality of what we learn as these representations for these words, things like semantic relationship evaluation, and then work on a Setswana news classification task. So now here's the data that we're dealing with. So you can see we've been able to take it up a lot in terms of what's all of the data that's available, just to train the things that represent the text, not yet the task that's downstream. If we take this and we look, one of the things that we did was saying, okay, we've collected this data. One of the things to just say, so one, for example, is JW300, that's a Jehovah's Witnesses corpus, because they translate a lot of their content into local African languages, actually. And that's going back to the point I made about the effect, of Christian missionaries on the availability of language resources. What this means is that if you just took that data and you put it into a machine learning algorithm, it would be biased towards a lot of religious concepts and not know much about anything else. So to the point, I think we were testing, one of the things we tested was, if we build models, do they identify that there's a relationship between the stars and the moon in Setswana? And it's sometimes hard, just because the data that you have on here is really biased towards religion. Right? Doesn't mean that that concept doesn't exist in Setswana. People know what happens, but it's because it's not recorded in a way that we can put into a machine. It's like it doesn't exist on there. So what we did is that we did topic modeling to identify what's inside, work with the linguists, teaching each other, us teaching machine learning, them teaching us about linguistics, and then learning how to create systems that can be better in this way. And then we can identify some things as general. There's things like personal names. There's some words that are mixed. So the data is not completely clean, even though we're trying to keep it that way. One of the things then is that there's this data set that was created in English to look at concepts that might be similar and then giving them a score. So if you have a score of 10, it's almost the same word. And then if it's a score of 0, those words are not related. We translated that into Setswana and then ran different models for representing the words, these word-to-vec models. And here, what you want is you have a number. This is a correlation. And if it's closer to 1, it's almost perfect, meaning that the representations match with what the humans had actually modeled. So the best I think we get in there is around 0.4, which is okay given other results on that part. So, but then we said that's not enough just to come up with an empirical number. What's going on here? Then working with other team members, we identified, for example, the one that's in red is a fast text representation that was released by Facebook, and it uses Wikipedia as a source instead of what we did in adding just a lot of sources on there. And we found that there's a lot, like here, it's supposed to be, there's a word, the first word, and then the rest of the words are supposed to be the ones that are similar to it, given what we've learned from the data. And this was it had a really bad score on that part, and you also see it that if you read that actually the words are not really are not as related. And then what you see, for example, is here, this one actually, there's Munna Mokape, Lumisimani, Moratua, Ngwana, they're related. Kind of on there, while the Facebook one might catch it, the first one, but then the rest it's kind of like it gets mixed, and the other ones are a bit of a mess on that part. So we tried to then go in and say, actually, we found that even though you had a high score here, the highest, the best quality was the one that had a lower score, but was higher than the Facebook one on that part. So one, it's telling us that we can still do work here and make sure we do it with care, and you can really be at a very competitive level internationally on this part. Then we went into this news classification task where we took now data from Botswana's daily news, which has a Setswana section, and then we categorized it on that part. So this is just a visualization of the data that's categorized in Setswana, and if there's a cluster there, it means that likely it has to do with one category on that part. So you would see these are the categories for the news, so these are an international standard. We translated all of the labels into Setswana as well. We built up the AI models there, and then you can see the performance in terms of that. So we're getting the 60s kind of again, but then now we built very much more robust models. We're using international standards in the categorization, and we now can check is the representation actually improving things. And then there's these models here, which is a transformer model that we're still developing at the moment to a 62, but we think we can 62% really improve it and hopefully get into the 70s or 80s. As I say, like, this is still a work in progress on that space. So in general, this is something called a confusion matrix. There are places where you make mistakes, so it's supposed to show us where there might be a category, but then the model is then predicting a different category. Some of them are very similar. On there, you might have something like society and culture that even if a human was to actually try and do that, might still mix those things up. So then, yes, where do we come to? Now we think we're at 60% in the data. The tooling that we've been building now, we're at 60% in terms of our capabilities on this part. To the point, this is the 2022 roadmap of the lab. So one of the things you will see that changed, my wife was complaining, why are you working on Setswana so much? These are all the languages in South Africa. These are all the students. They don't have names, but then you can see like some of the keywords of their topics. We do this just to keep track of everybody, and you can see what languages they're working on when there's a check mark, and you can see the number of students that are working on what language. So for 2022, we're covering all the South African languages that are not in the top 2 within these spaces. Already, I think the Siswati isiZulu now is out, hopefully for examination for that thesis. On that part, the Chivenda very active, Chitsonga very active, all those things. Hopefully at the end of the year, there'll be lots of nice new papers that come within the space on there. This is also a general view now of all the work that has come in, because we've been building up these capabilities, and on there where we're doing social media analysis, forensics on data, more models for things like Setswana and Sepedi, more augmentation. This is a very large project working together, many researchers across the world to build up these augmentation tools, things like financial sentiment analysis, and this was published actually yesterday on attribution of who writes what on this part. The last part then on this one is thinking about the thing of, again, we can't wait, and no one is coming to save us. But we are the ones who we have been waiting for. Here is to then think about the concept of Ubuntu, that motu ke motu kabato, I am because like we are. We need to check, especially as researchers, how in our daily work of our community, especially in research, like what is it that we're trying to get to on this part? Is it just publishing the papers, getting the grants, or really making a change, right? So how in thinking about this, do we plan for abundance of availability of things? How are you also mindful of the needs of the youth in this country who we rely on as being pipelines to come into our research environments? On there, especially the emerging researchers, the developers, and the engineers, do really also show compassion in this space. And thinking about this, for a number of us, it meant then thinking about the community that we want to build on. So with this, in the last part, I wanted to talk about grassroots artificial intelligence, and really in thinking about this is like how unreasonably effective collaborative research is, where you break down the walls. You really don't look at how the incentive systems in research are actually built up, and just do the work on this part. So what are grassroots AI movements? They lower barrier to entry, multidisciplinary, they're inclusive, they work to address systemic issues, they're collaborative, independent, and multi-institutional, holistic, and community focused. So if you go back over time, you had, for example, things like CERN and the Santa Fe Institute. But when you're thinking about machine learning, they started becoming in 2013 the emergence of these grassroots AI movements. So women in machine learning, black in AI in the 2016s, widening NLP. We started the deep learning in Daba. I'll talk a little bit about that. On the Data Science Africa, which is a sister organization in Western East Africa. As you see time go on, as these grassroots AI organizations are becoming better and better, you also start seeing things like spin-offs like Masakani, which is looking at natural language processing. And then from there, you see North Africans NLP, Ghana NLP. You see other like America's NLP in Latin America on that part. So why is this actually going on? Why this proliferation? So Masakani here was one of the organizations co-founded in 2019, and it's a grassroots organization whose mission is to strengthen and spur NLP research in African languages for Africans by Africans on there. And Masakane translates to "we build together" in isiZulu on there. And really the goal is like Africans should be the ones who shape and own these technologies, right? Instead of them just being dumped here. What's this community like? It's a distributed research community, many organizations, to the point that right now in 2022, it almost has over 1,000 researchers across the continent. More than 35 African countries, more than 40 African languages covered. 40 GitHub contributors, more than 40 publications, and 2 conference workshops. That's 3 years of just working and people saying, let's work kind of together. This is the board of directors. I sit on this as an advisor on there of different people who cover different spaces within this natural language processing. What makes really Masakane unique is that we look at the full pipeline. It's not just at the end where the machine learning scientist shows up and then publishes a paper, but then we work to make sure people are doing data collection. They're going into communities, they're recording, they're writing, all those things. They're figuring out new ways to collect data and create these resources. And then those same people work with annotators, with curators, they work with language technologists, they work with the people who then have the system at the end. What this meant is that in the first publication that came through was this participatory research paper in 2021, hopefully I got this right, end of 2020. And this, as you can see, is very different to a lot of papers in research. You can see how many authors on there. It built 47 translation models for 35 African languages and lots of evaluation of trying to understand how these translation models work, where the issues are in getting these translation models to go. We would have been like, only now, about I think a month ago, did Google actually release a Xitsonga translation system, and we already had before that. And even then, we knew that it will have lots of errors, and guess what? Even the Google one has errors, and in this space on there. This was the winner of the inaugural Wikimedia Research Award, right, for trying to democratize the internet. But that's not all. There's been many more papers that have come out of this community. As I said, more than 1,000 researchers, and this is really world-class research that is being done by this community of people who just join in, talk about a problem, and say, let's do something kind of about it. Well, one of the things that have also been is also creating tools that are available to other people. So here we have the translator Masakane.io. So our research group here at UP took these models that were created by the community, the Masakane community, and then created a website that you can even go right now, translator Masakane.io, and there's models that are on there, and more are coming as we then evaluate and check that the quality is correct. But then also it's a research project that if you find something that's wrong, you can actually give feedback on there. There's another one which is speech, text-to-speech, which is then under speech.masakane.io. So these tools are not just like for the researchers, but for other people as well. And there's many other projects like here, the Decolonize Science, working to translate abstracts into African languages, scientific abstracts into African languages, and make them available, because then we can build machine learning tools that can do that automatically, right? Or be part of the step on the translation. Just imagine now opening up science, right, in local languages. And there are things like knowing our names, a database of African names, going behind Swahili in East Africa, and things like Hausa NLP on building out things like insight and safety online on there. So that's Masakane. The last one is deep learning in Daba. And here was really this idea in 2016, going back 3 years before Masakane, of, hey, we need to make sure Africans become critical contributors, owners, and shapers of machine learning and AI. It should not be just a technology that we take or like gets dumped here, and we're actually not building it up, and it doesn't also carry our values, right? Remember when I was talking about language and saying value, we have values as our communities. How do we then shape these technologies? So we started this in 2016. The first event we had was a conference in 2017, and it had 300 participants with a very clear focus on sharing the science and then building the strength of the community. This was at VET. In 2018, we went to Stellenbosch University. We doubled in size. And that's 660 of people who were accepted with over 1,500 applications from across the continent, right? Showing you that there's a lot of people on there. When people say, oh, we don't have the skill, no, we have it. It's not nurtured in a way. Kenya, we went in 2019, 650 on there. Obviously, COVID happened, and we're now coming back in August 2022. We're going to Tunisia on there. So we'll know in about 3 weeks what the total number of people who will be able to come to Tunisia will be. This is really a place where people come to share their research, learn from each other, and really build up AI that represents us. And in many ways, there's things like practicals where people learn how to do it. You can be a beginner, you can be intermediate, and you can also be an expert. There's something for you. People get an opportunity to discuss their work, really engage on what's going on, and also find ways that they can, find other champions or people who are in their same path that they can work together with on there. For a lot of students, this was the first time they actually could talk with another AI expert and show off their research work and get feedback. Right? And this doesn't need to be, I need to go to Europe or the United States to do. It can be done here on that part. We also look at things like the societal part, impact of machine learning. This was a workshop we co-organized also with UNESCO at the Indaba. It's become this place where there's these workshops on there. And as you can see, that's the 650 many people meeting every year in a very serious way, spending 6 days together on that part. And then these are some of our co-organizers. This is from the Stellenbosch one. This has actually led to a revolution in some ways. One, in Latin America, they started Kipu as an Indaba-like event. In the same way, there was East European Machine Learning Summer School and the Southeast Asian Machine Learning Summer School. In the international AI community, these are known as Indaba-like organizations, meaning the Indaba was the trailblazer, and they've now come and said there's a new, there's another way to build up these communities that can then work in this way, in this space. So there is that work of building up that community of practice, of research, and also learning from each other. What I want to, especially within the space, or sometimes looking at the state of science in South Africa and thinking that we have less resources, we have less people and all those things, is that during this time we have to be very careful in there. We should really be building bridges instead of trying to build barriers just to keep small amounts of resources to yourselves. So a quote from Black Panther there is that in times of crisis, the wise build bridges instead of and the foolish build barriers. And this is what we've been trying to do in these organizations that we've been working on. So finally, just as a call to action, really, we should tell our stories. How do we increase the amount of digital resources available, text, audio, video, multimedia in our languages? Universities, should be translating some of their research abstracts to geographically relevant language where they are, I've given you what's the state of these resources. Government communication should be in local language. Collaboration with linguistic researchers, NLP researchers, and publishers to benefit our languages. How do we innovate our way forward in increasing participation and world-class research in NLP in South Africa, the continent, and beyond? We need to support young and emerging researchers with resources to explore really some of these tough problems. We need to support and acknowledge and reward cross and transdisciplinary research work in these spaces. You can't do this, in this work, if you looked at just sitting in one small little slice, there's no way we can actually attempt to take on some of these problems, right? And we need to break the barriers between institutions. There's actually a talk which will be is available online that I gave at the Council of Higher Education in 2020, really looking at this as the case for collaboration and cooperation instead of being very competitive in terms of tackling these challenges. For us at the Data Science for Social Impact Research Group, we can help by supporting our work in language resource collection, modeling, and sponsoring research activities. Help us engage between academia, government, industry, and researchers. You can get in touch on that website. On there, for prospective students, there's a page you can go to check on there, and there's also opportunities for collaborators to come in. At the University of Pretoria, we also have a Master's in Big Data Science, where I also teach a natural language processing elective as well on there. Thanks also for the support of many, many people. On one looking at ABSA as the sponsor of my position as ABSA UP chair here, but then also grants, gifts, and fellowships for many, many different organizations that have helped us really push through. And these are either to myself or the group or to individual students for them to be able to study and do like really the great work that they do on that part. And really, it does take a village. I'm thankful for the lab, the family, the friends, the colleagues, and collaborators who've been through this journey and really keep pushing the envelope on here. There's actually a very special acknowledgement. There's one office in the university that I email a lot, and I've gotten to the point now where it's very easy for me to leave them with some of the toughest problems. Remember, if you're talking about digital resources, you have to think about things like copyright, you have to think about IP, you have to think about how we share, how we also empower, especially things like small publishers in those things. And we've gotten into a very good working relationship with our research office where we can sit down around the table and try to think of innovative ways to really get these things going. Because if we don't, we just lie in the point of saying, well, we can't talk to each other. And as I said, more time passes, the debt gets bigger on there. So thank you for being here. And then, yes, I think if there's any questions.
Thank you, Professor Marivate, for a very enlightening and a very stimulating talk. So we have time for a few questions. Can I just see, and please just raise your hand. We've got a roaming mic. Please don't use the mic in front of you. So we have a question here on the right-hand side.
People using less words, thousands of words less than before. Linked to that also censorship on the internet and the impact that this has on language progression. Okay, point number 2. I was surprised to see that you didn't use music as one of your sources, because especially during the apartheid struggle, most of the stories about South Africa, I mean, if you got into reggae, you know, you could almost do extensive research on apartheid just through what they said about apartheid in reggae music. And I mean, that's just one type of music. Then I'm not even talking about our music and the excessive amount of information and language uses we have there. And then just one thing that I don't know, you didn't make any mention of that. Our only subject thus far with language processing or language learning has been with humanity. And that maybe skews it to a little bit of extent because it doesn't allow us to think broader. But there's now pioneering work being done with animals. Specifically, they have taken these buttons that they created with words for dogs and cats. And yes, there are the obvious things that would come out, as you can imagine, like some of the most favorite things that they talk about would be treats, playing, going outside, and obviously with dogs pooing. But the interesting thing is, and this is especially prevalent with the one dog, she keeps wanting to know about these images that she sees in her sleep. And nobody taught her. She physically, the buttons that she were given with the words, she physically started putting together these concepts, and they had to expand the buttons to keep up with her. So I think if we incorporate the animal language learning, especially into the computer learning, I think that would literally explode it onto a next level. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. I think a quick one on that so that we can move to the next question. There's language evolves all the time. I think I've been asked a lot about this, especially now, like we collaborate with linguists and then people want to be very formal. And I have a view that we find the languages where they are. And also because of social media, the very interesting thing, one of the projects we're trying to work on is looking at the last 15 years of language evolution that we see now very quickly because of social media. It's very interesting that you can find words that are like, South African languages, but now are being used in Nigeria. And that's the thing that actually for us is very exciting on that part. The other one, yeah, sure, you can think about the formalisms. I did spend some time in Scotland at Diverse Intelligence Summer Institute, and there's a lot of work that goes into understanding also animals and how intelligence goes in there. And there's people who are working on that, but not within this space on that one. For the other ones, we can then talk, I guess, about. Yes, move to the second question.
So we'll take the last question now, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and congratulations, Professor Marivate. I was struck by your point about the longer we wait, the more expensive it becomes to tackle this social challenge. And I think that one thing, and you don't say it, you're a scientist, not a politician, but as a social justice person, I must say it, how horribly our languages have been neglected and how low the investment. And this decade, the UN has declared as the UN Decade for Indigenous Languages. And I want to challenge the universities, the vice-chancellors, to do an indaba on indigenous languages during this decade and set some goals about what should be achieved. And that it requires investment. We have the skills, we have the people, but we require investment. My one question is that your sources of data, you didn't mention indigenous storytellers or indigenous knowledge systems. So an example I can give is Katrina Iso, who's the last speaker of the new language. There were 20 in 1994. She's the last mother tongue speaker. She's managed to teach other people, but she's the last mother tongue speaker. There's Madosini, there's Grinam Hlope. There's these people who are like fountains of indigenous knowledge. And I would think that they would be good sources of data, especially as they are almost custodians of the richness of language.
Thank you for that comment and that question. And yes, through the Masakane project, we are looking at that a lot. There are researchers who are going into remote communities, working on that specifically, on identifying, and then even in our, when in science you apply for grants, they work with them to apply for grants that assist in the whole process, right? People get remunerated for spending the time, allowing then to tell folk tales in their languages, get it either written. Some people have to even come up with the correct way to write some of the words that are being spoken on that part. But yes, it's not easy. I think there's work, especially out of some of our researchers in Masakane in Namibia, who are doing those type of things. And we're trying also in reaching out to the South African, especially young researchers in linguistics, to identify these opportunities that we can work together, where we bring on the technology side and they bring it, and they say like, okay, we can bring in these storytellers and we can do those things. So I am excited about it, but yes, we need to get those resources.
Thank you, Professor Marivate. Let's put our hands together for an excellent talk. I'm going to ask Professor Kupe to say a few closing remarks. Thank you.
So, thank you very much. I think that was, ladies and gentlemen, you agree, a very highly insightful presentation and really brilliant in a number of ways. You referred, I think you made in one of your slides, you said, we are the ones you have been waiting for. You will recall, since you quoted one other African writer, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, on decolonizing the mind. There is another writer, Chinua Achebe, who wrote the book, the novel, The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born. You just contradicted him. So it's very interesting because between Achebe and Ngugi is also a story. Sorry, it's Achebe's. Between Achebe and Ngugi, between Achebe and Ngugi is a dialogue about which tradition you follow. One can say that Achebe followed very much the classical European tradition of how you write a novel, whereas Ngugi and, by the way, Ama contradicted what Achebe did. Remember 2000 Seasons. And you seem to be in that tradition of decolonizing, if you like, and also deconstructing colonialism. What was beautiful about this is that for once you never mentioned the concept of the fourth industrial revolution. And that what is good about that is that the notion of the fourth industrial revolution has created the impression that technologies are inconsistent with what is considered African and traditional. And by going to African languages, which are marginalized by colonialism. And you brought it down to the level of how can we actually regain our agency as Africans in order to transform our own lives. So all of the things you talked about, impact and all of that. So, and this is actually, if you like, decolonize high quality African scholarship for social impact and transformation. You also showed multiple sustainable pathways for African researchers. And of course, I'm a vice chancellor of a university. I'm always interested in whether young researchers and academics do really locate their research and their activities in the strategy of the university. We have a new 5-year strategy, and many elements in this slide are about what our strategy is about. Transdisciplinary research, multiple collaborations, Africans in those collaborations, and the rest of the world following us. So, by virtue of the power vested me as Vice Chancellor, you will get a salary increase, a bonus, plus a promotion. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Another